This is Join Us in France, episode 510. 510. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we take a conversational journey through the beauty, culture, and flavors of France. Today, I bring you a conversation with Brian Tolleson about buying and renovating property in France with a side of moving a dog to France. Brian shares his first-hand experience of buying and renovating a home in the stunning French Riviera, offering unique and practical advice for those considering similar endeavors. As always, this episode is full of insider tips, practical advice, personal stories, and as you listen, you'll get a comprehensive view of what it's like doing something like this, which I know a lot of you are dreaming about. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my itinerary consult service, my GPS self-guided tours of Paris on the Voice Map app, or take a day trip with me around the southwest of France in my electric car. And I'm doing several of those in September, so that's really exciting. You can browse all of that at my boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And remember, Patreon supporters get the podcast ad-free as soon as it's ready. Click on the link in the show notes to enjoy this Patreon reward for as little as $2 a month. There will not be a magazine part of the podcast today because I have been away in Paris all week for the Paralympics. When I'm back next week, I'll tell you much more about it. To join this wonderful community of Francophiles, go to patreon.com/joinus, Patreon, join us, no spaces or dashes. And to support Elise, go to patreon.com/Elise Art. Bonjour, Brian Tolleson, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Bonjour, Annie. How are you?
I'm great. Lovely to see you again. You were a bootcamp member, so we know each other in person. And you were also on the recent episode about the bootcamp. So people have heard your voice before. So today we're going to talk about buying and renovating property in France, which is something you are doing, or perhaps it looks like you're done. About the visa process, about traveling with a dog, your Yorkie Terrier Junior. And we'll talk about the place where your home is, Valbonne, which is kind of, to situate a little bit, it's 12 kilometers north of Cannes and 16 kilometers northwest, a tiny bit, of Antibes. So, in the French Riviera, a beautiful, beautiful place. Also pretty close to Sophia Antipolis, Mougins, places like that we haven't talked all that much about on the podcast. So that's going to be fun as well. So do tell, how did this project started for you, Brian?
So my husband and I have been coming to France for decades and decades. And we sort of, I don't think we realized it, but we've sort of been trying out different parts of France. We've been in the Paris region, we've been in the north, we've been in the south quite a bit. And we really fell in love with the south of France and the sort of Mediterranean vibe of the south. And so we started looking here about 10 years ago. And then about 3 years ago, we sort of stumbled onto our village, to Valbonne. It's been a love affair ever since, of the little town. And what's great is being so close, as you said, to Sophia Antipolis, which is like the Silicon Valley of France, which we've managed to build some business relationships and start to kind of rebuild our life in France. It's going to take some time to sort of transition completely, but we started and it's just been wonderful.
Right. So because you're from the Atlanta area originally.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a native Atlantan, but I spent my career in Los Angeles. And so the south of places just feels like home to me, I think. And I see so many commonalities between Southern Europe and the American South. Some of the historical culture and also the challenges historically that both regions have faced and overcome, and sort of being the new center of culture and life in both places.
Right. Okay, so you fell in love with the place, you bought a place. Tell us about the buying. Well, to begin with, how long did it take you from purchase to completion?
So buying in France is very different from buying in the US. The process is just very different. And we sort of learned as we went and I think made some mistakes along the way, which we can talk about. But I think from start to finish, it takes about 4 months from sort of like, I love this place to here's your keys. It's about a 4 month process, or sometimes 5 months, it just depends. And I actually just bought my neighbor's place to renovate. We sort of got addicted to renovation here. And that process took about 5 months, but our first place only took about 3 months.
That's fast.
Yeah, pretty fast. But what's really interesting to know is there's no such thing as like buyer's agents in France, really. I mean, it's not the same at all. You basically deal with the seller's agent when you make every part of the process. And there's no central listing service exactly. We found that houses and apartments.fr has most of the listings, but not all the listings. And you kind of have to go agency by agency in the area.
Houses and apartments, not one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, it has a lot of the sort of aggregate of things. It does a better job, but it's definitely not everything. I would say they have about half the listings. And then the other half are just with each seller's agent. And you have to go agency by agency. Looking in shop windows for ads is not the worst way to find property in France because it's kind of the only thing to do. That was an interesting process to not have your own agent as a buyer. And then there's no mortgages for Americans, really. I mean, it's just not something that happens here. They don't like giving mortgages to Americans. So most of it is cash, unless you're moving here full time. And then there's opportunities to, I think, once you have a job here,
right,
to get a mortgage.
Yeah, it's hard enough for French people to get a mortgage. For people who are just coming in and don't have a job, I can't imagine. Yeah. My husband is American, and we bought our house based on his mortgage because Join Us was just starting and I wasn't making very much money at the time. And it worked, but that's because he had a full-time income in France. So it's not that they don't want to lend to Americans, it's just that they want you to be in the French system fully.
Right. And so we were fortunate that we had some property that we had sold in the US. So we just sort of turned that profit into our place here. So we had the cash on hand. But I think, that's one of the challenges I think for people to think about is that. And there's also some tax things you have to think about when you look at the price of property. Anything over a certain threshold, and it changes every year, is subject to an additional tax for holding it. And it's sort of added to all your property. So if you have a house in the US and you have a house in France, they add those two numbers together and that's what you're taxed on. So that's something to think about. But also the process is really different. The offer for a buyer is actually not that serious. I mean, it is serious in the sense that once you have a signed offer with a seller, they can't sell it to anybody else.
Right.
But you can kind of pull out any time before you get this second phase called the promesse.
Promesse de vente.
Promesse de vente. And that's basically your contract. But that takes like a month to get back and to also go through all the process. And they inundate you with information about the house. I mean, you get everything from the seismic activity in your region to the history of termites in your neighborhood. You get probably, I would say, 80 pages of information about your property. And that all happens as part of this promesse. And then once you sign the promesse, which is sort of like your official contract, then you have 10 days to basically be like, okay, if I don't want this, after the promesse is signed, I have 10 days to decide.
Right.
And actually, we pulled out of our first contract during that period because we discovered that we have a house now, a little house in the village. In the US, you kind of call it a townhouse, but it was built in like 1650 or something.
Yeah. Maison de village.
Maison de village. Absolutely. But the first place we had was more of an apartment. It was sort of part of a maison de village. And the problem with it was there's no syndicate. And that's something to really, like Americans, we're so used to having HOAs and boards and common ownership of things. But in France, that can be super informal.
Yeah.
Like there's nobody who decides who fixes the roof, No. Yeah. And so we pulled out of that contract because we were like, there's just no way that 3,000 miles away, we can manage a roof that nobody owns. But then after that, there's also a process for the mairie to go through where the mayor basically gets to review your property sale and decide if they want to buy it instead. Because they don't have eminent domain the way we do in the US. So that's how they do eminent domain is like, we've agreed on a price. Does the mayor want to pay that price or is he going to let the sale go through? And so that takes like another month generally for that process to happen.
May not be true everywhere you buy, though. Yeah, I think the maison de village is kind of a different kettle of fish. Yeah.
And then you go to the closing, and the closing is actually very similar to the US, pretty fast and smooth. Although I will say we made the mistake. So it's very important, especially for Americans, anything banking related. I know you've talked about this before. A lot of people talk about this. Anything banking related for Americans is very overly sensitive. And so I had used a Wise account that I had in my name. Wise accounts are basically in single people's names. You don't have joint accounts. And so my husband and I had put funds in my Wise account to do the conversion for the rate. And then the funds basically came from my name and not our joint name. Well, that became a huge problem for the closing because you have to prove that the funds came from joint assets if you're buying it jointly.
Yeah.
So just be careful when you're like sending money for your closing that comes from a joint account if you're buying it jointly. That was just so I had to basically go and show I had to document, here's where the money came out of the joint account, went into my Wise account, came out of my Wise account,
An extra step. In the US, I remember they wanted me as a French citizen to show that the money didn't come from somebody else, the down payment money. So banks have rules that are a bit complicated at times. So yeah, there's some hoops to jump through.
I mean, that was just one of those 11th hour, rushes to get documents together and all that. Yeah.
Very good. And one thing I would like to point out about you get a big stack of documents, 80 pages, that with a lot of verification, the efficiency of your heating system, of your water heater, of your windows, things like that. That doesn't mean that they don't try to hide things. Okay. Right. So you do have to be really, really do your due diligence. If you're worried about, I don't know, water leaks, about sewage, about things like that, do some investigating before you buy, because there are a lot of things that they will try to just push under the rug if they can. And with a foreign buyer, they might try to do that more than with a French buyer, because in our case, French-American couple, everything happened in French. So as far as everything was concerned, it was all like French people, except that we had the American part that played a role as well.
Yeah, I will say finding a notaire that speaks English really well is important, because the notaire is basically the closing attorney. And it's very helpful for them to speak English very well. I feel like certainly the one we worked with kind of looked out for our interests as well and made sure that we understood everything. You're even required to have a translator. I speak French a little, but definitely not for all the terminology and vocabulary of closing property. So they make you pay a translator, an official translator, to be at the closing.
That's a good idea. Just in case. Just in case.
Yeah.
All right. So then once you bought this place, you went on to renovating it.
Yes. So some of the house had been done. I mean, they had done some renovations and they had done a good job. And in fact, we bought it from the person who had lived here, and they were also a contractor. So we were very lucky in that sense that we already knew someone and seen the quality of their work. And it was really good quality, which I think is important. In a traditional French way, there was only one full shower room and multiple toilettes, but we decided we wanted another shower room on the top floor, because these village houses are basically, vertical living. To be in the master bedroom on the top floor and have to go down 3 floors to shower was just not ideal. We bought a bunch of robes and we're walking around the house in our robes. So we decided to put a shower room on the top floor. I think the process was excellent because we already knew a really good contractor. And that's sort of my advice for anybody who's doing renovations is a contractor, just like in the US, is everything. But also what I didn't realize, and you realize when you go through the buying process, you have to have everything documented. So it's not just like, oh, hey, let's pay a guy to do something. Because when you go to sell the house, you have to have it all documented and have these warranties provided for every project. And these warranties, I think they're called the guarantee décennale.
Décennale, yes.
They're 10-year warranties for every bit of work. And you have to provide that for anything that you do to any potential buyer.
Right.
It's great to have, because if they do some repair or make some renovation and it damages your house, they have an insurance policy that they pay for to do it.
And that means you can't hire your uncle to do things under the carpet. You have to get a licensed contractor to do things. Now, if you decide not to, which you can, then if you're going to sell the house and there's a problem, they might turn against the seller instead of against the contractor.
Right. Everything is so well documented in France that the exact description of your house is entered into the deed. And when you go to sell the house, if what you're selling is different from what they knew about before, you have to be able to say, like, oh, yeah, that second shower room, here's the 42 pages of guarantees that you need, demonstrate that I actually legitimately added this and it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because my contractor doesn't really speak English. Google Translate and WhatsApp have been an amazing combination just to go back and forth. And my husband, who speaks zero French, is able to have many texts back and forth, just translating as you go.
Right. So the problem I ran into in Spain is that some contractors, they don't want to type a message. They want to send you a voice memo. And I have this one guy, that's what he does. He sends me these 3-4 minutes voice memos. And I'm not sure everything he said.
Right.
So I use the transcription services to get that stuff transcripted, and then I can hopefully make sense of the stuff that I missed. It can be difficult if you don't speak the language, but there's ways. I mean, there are ways to get around that.
Yeah. I think we're, part of the reason we're really shifting our focus to France for, especially even for business, is that I really believe that real-time translation is just moments away. I mean, we're really going to be able to have more and better real-time translation conversations in the next 2 to 3 years.
That fast, you think, huh?
Oh, for sure. The smaller AI models that they're developing now is just really we're years away, just not decades away.
Yeah. Well, I made a very good living as a technical translator for about 20 years. And then the rates plummeted because the AI stuff was just getting too good. And that was not the stuff that was available to the public. But now you can throw that stuff into ChatGPT and it will just do a really good job.
Yeah, it does a really good job.
So yeah, no more money in translation, that's for sure. All right. So overall, for you, it was a good experience, good enough that you are moving on to renovating another place.
Yes. We've, I think, gotten addicted to renovating places in France now. And we're starting on our next adventure with the same contractor, fortunately,
right,
that we closed literally like 4 days ago on our neighbor's place. So we're going to start that process.
Are they joined properties?
We're still sort of figuring that out. You have to be really careful on these old stone houses that were built in the 1600s. It's like tap, 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 the whole wall falls down. So I think an engineer is going to have to come and see, like, can you actually go through? Because I don't want to knock down like half the village just with our projects.
They do not want you to do that either.
No, they do not. They do not want
they
to
do not. That's great.
You don't want to be the American who knocked down the village.
No, but this really happens. Like in the city center of Toulouse, the old houses like that, there has been some places that tumble down. And one of them in the recent past, they actually could tell this was happening because there were cracks appearing on the outside of the facade all of a sudden. And they evacuated several houses, that one and several houses around it. And like 2 or 3 days later, it crumbled. So they are now deciding what to do. They found new places for these people, etc. But it's possible. Old village houses can fall down when they are not maintained properly over the decades. And when people do shoddy work, like they open some door or windows and they don't do the proper engineering calculations, because these stone houses weigh a lot. This is not like opening a window in a wood framed house.
And like the US, a lot of the old houses, you have to get approval from the mairie to do any sort of change. We have to get approval even to change the colors of our shutters, because that gets approved by the mairie.
So you have a good relationship with your mairie?
Yeah, enough where I feel like I can pop down there and ask a question. And they actually all speak English. They're very generous and kind. There's a lot of expats in our region, in our village, so they're used to being patient and friendly. And also that's the thing about the South, and I saw that in Toulouse as well. People are just friendlier. They're not stressed out and busy. I lived in New York City for a long time, so I understand why people in Paris are the way they are, because it's just, hectic and busy. But in the South, everybody is very friendly. Of course, the opposite of that is you go into a shop to get your cheese and you're going to talk for 20 minutes with each person. And you're the third person in line. So you're like, I'm here for an hour. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to do the math. I know I'm here for an hour.
It's not efficient most of the time. Yes. I was in Paris. Actually, even in Paris, I was writing my tour, the Les Halles food tour, and I was in this boucherie charcuterie. And the guy, I swear to God, he was like talking to this lady for like 10 minutes. And they were not talking about food. They were talking about family things, whatever. Even in the center of Paris, this happens. And I was about third or fourth person in line. Thankfully, he had no relationship with the people after this lady. So that went a lot faster. But, if you have friends and family in line, you're in trouble.
That's sort of what I love about France too. I've learned so much about cheese by being behind the people in line and hearing about their cheese. The cheese guy will go into like, this particular cow ate this flour and it made this cheese. And I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. And I tried cheese. I'd be like, oh, I want to try that cheese. I heard that whole story.
In your notes, talking about not cheese, but other things to buy, you talk about Castorama and places like that. So, of course, if you're renovating or moving in somewhere new, you're going to be going to these places. Le Roi Merlin is another big one.
Yeah, Castorama, it was like my biggest discovery because you can never find the exact translation store. It's not exactly Home Depot or Lowe's, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
There's certain things they don't have, but then they have all this other stuff that you can't get there. Trying to find a place to buy electronics, all the brand names are different, but Darty turned out to be sort of Best Buy for the US.
Yeah. So Darty, Boulanger are big in France. But if you go to Germany or Spain, they have Media Market, which is a German company that's very much like Best Buy. You walk in there and you're like, is this like a Best Buy? It looks exactly the same. I wonder if it's the same corporation. It might be the same corporate.
Right.
Because it looks so similar. In France, we don't have that. So Castorama is kind of middle of the road. Then you have Leroy Merlin. They have more stuff for decorating. If you want specific lights, door handles, things like that, you go to Leroy Merlin. And then you have the places where it's just construction. In Spain, it's Obramat. In France, it's the same company, but there's another name for it in France. So you have some companies that do nothing but heavy construction things where you'll get your beams and your, but contractors will know about these places. Mostly, if you're not doing the work yourself, you will just go to Leroy Merlin or Castorama. Are they far from you?
No, there's one in Antibes, which is 7 or 8 minutes away. So it's not far. To your point about doing your projects yourself, like we've done some of our own projects. Our filter for doing the projects is like, does this change the description of our property on the deed eventually? Because if it does, then you need to have all that paperwork and you need to hire somebody to do that work. You can't add a bathroom yourself, or you shouldn't, because if you go to sell it, you're going to be in trouble down the road.
Right. So like one example, if you're going to change your windows, I would advise you to go through a professional contractor who changes windows. If you're going to do drapes, of course you do that yourself. But it's the same in the US, isn't it?
No, you don't have to document the changes the same way in the closing process. You do want to hire a good contractor because obviously you don't want them to tear your house apart and not be insured, but it's not the same level of legal responsibility.
That's true. In the US, nobody asks you who did the work.
No.
Yeah. So long as the buyer thinks it's good enough, then it's good enough.
Yeah. And we actually found some subcontractors to do little projects from the closing documents because they had attached their invoices. And I was like, oh, they did a good job on that sink repair. So I called them.
Yeah. How did you find this guy? Like, was it just somebody told you about him or?
No, he actually lived in my house. And so it was like basically the contractor's house. And he did a really good job because it was his house, I think, too. He did quality work.
If you don't have that situation, how would you go about finding contractors to do work?
It's hard to say. In a little village like ours, everybody knows everybody and everything. And so my next door neighbor had done renovations too. And I've asked her for references and referrals for things. So asking around.
It's about talking to people because there are companies that try to put together these websites where you can ask for quotes and whatever. It's a complete waste of time. Nobody will ever contact you from a form you filled out online. Don't do it that way. Just talk to people around you. You can even go to places, Castor, Leroy Merlin. Sometimes they have a board where the contractors can leave a business card if you want to look for that. You can ask your mairie.
Real estate agents, there's always great real estate agents. They tend to know good people that have done work because they're interested in quality work for selling your property later. Real estate agents have been very helpful too.
Yeah. I think Americans have this idea that you can do everything online. And in France, that's never how it works. Even if there are online resources, it's about talking to people. That's why I think this podcast is helpful, because you hear people talking, they explain their process, and that's how everything works in France. If you want good restaurants and things like that, talk to people. The online stuff for restaurants is getting better, but it's still better to talk to people.
Yeah, 100%. We get things like postcards dropped in our mailbox with like, here's a resource to find good contractors. And a friend of mine actually saw that and said, oh my gosh, never, ever, ever call this, because it's just bad places that don't do a good job.
They are just trying to get your data, which they're going to resell to everybody. These are not contractors. Contractors are not good at putting together a good website. That's not what they do. It's like restaurants. The best restaurants in France don't even have a website. Like they don't want to spend any time on that. On Google, they probably have their times completely wrong, opening and closing times, because that's not what they do. To do this properly, you have to be an online geek. And most of us are not. Don't rely on these resources. It's best to talk to people. So Obramat in Spain is bricomat in France. They usually do more heavy duty kind of things, not the pretty stuff. Bricoman, we also have Bricoman. And everywhere you go, you'll find these little stores. Some of them are pretty small. It's very handy to not have to drive an hour to the big city. The biggest city to you is Cannes, right?
Yeah, I do stuff in Cannes and Nice pretty equally. They're both about the same distance, about 15 minutes.
Yeah. Nice is also 15 minutes.
Yeah, 15, 20.
Antibes is pretty close.
Yeah, Antibes is very close. It's about 10, 15 minutes. All depends on traffic. This time of year in July, Antibes is probably 20 because of the beach traffic and all the
damn foreigners coming.
Yes, all the beach goers.
Yeah. Yes. All right, let's talk about the visa process for this whole adventure, because that's a big deal.
Again, like the contractor, I think hiring a professional is like the key. You can do this stuff yourself, but I'm still in the process. So I've been doing this for maybe 8 months now, and I'm still waiting for my CoteDAzur, but I'm approved on my visa and all that. I did the entrepreneur visa. We are setting up a business here in France, really consulting between Southern Europe and the American South, called Connexion South. I couldn't have done it without a professional visa consultant. We worked with Allison Grant-Lunis, who I think you know, and I think you've been on her podcast or something.
Yeah.
I mentioned you to her and that I was going on the boot camp, and she was like, oh, I know Annie.
I need to invite her on, join us as well. I haven't gotten around to it, but I fully intend to, because she knows her stuff very well, doesn't she?
She does. She is like a bureaucrat's bureaucrat. She just knows all the detail on everything, to the point that when we went to turn in our first application packet, which was, again, 40 pages, she said, you're going to walk into this place. They're going to have no idea what you are going to give them. That's what always happens. And you're going to tell them, it's okay. This is all correct. Take this, take this, take this. And she was absolutely right. I mean, they had no clue, none at all. I think they're used to processing tourist visas for people who are not Americans, who aren't in the Schengen region. She was amazing all the way through. But there's a big backup at the prefecture right now for the CoteDAzur. So I'm just waiting on the final thing. But we've been approved and all that.
So even somebody who does a very good job, a very thorough job, it's not going to be super fast. So this is something you need to understand. I've actually had someone contact me and say, hey, what about this Lunis person? Is she legit? Because my friend hasn't heard back, whatever. I contacted her and I said, oh, this person is asking me, like, I have nothing to do with this. And she said, oh yeah, it's in process. And this person is just really, really impatient. Just wants it done right now. Right. Nothing gets done right now in France. Relax, people. It will get done eventually, but not right now. So as long as you have somebody on your side who's very good at crossing their T's and dotting their I's, you're good. It'll happen. But Just be patient.
Yeah. Now, if you're going to do the long-term stay visa, which is just the 1-year visa, basically for like retirees, that is a much faster process. And I have a friend who got that within a month.
Oh, wow.
It was very fast because it's only a year visa, so they treat it very differently than they do the 5 and the 10-year visas. So it goes very, very quickly.
And also, you're young enough that you're going to work. Obviously, you're not a retiree.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the restriction on that is you can't work. So technically, even if you remote work for an American company, like you cannot do that in France with that visa. That tends to be, I think, a lot faster. But the other visa types, not so fast.
I didn't ask you this, but I want to, before we move on to the dog thing, as far as costs are concerned, do you find the cost of buying a house, renovating a house, even the cost of getting your visa, do you find that reasonable, or has any of that been surprisingly either cheap or expensive?
The prices are very similar in my region to the US. I mean, housing prices are very similar. It's not like you're going to get a super duper deal. It's going to be about what you would pay in a good sized US city. Housing prices are very similar. Renovation costs are, I would think, a little more expensive. Everything's gotten more expensive, so it's hard to say. I wasn't like, wow, that's so cheap. I was like, oh, well, that's reasonable. We've renovated a bunch of houses, my husband and I, and it's always more expensive than you ever think it's going to be.
Bring money, lots of money.
Have that 20%, set aside for that 20% extra that it's going to cost at some point.
Yeah.
But so that hasn't been cheaper. The visa process, I feel like I'm getting good value, with Allison. I don't think it feels super inexpensive. I think she's working very hard and her team is doing a lot of work for our process. That feels pretty reasonable. So I think it's pretty on par. The thing that I find that is always surprisingly inexpensive in France is the food. Like the food is so good and so delicious and so fresh and so amazing. And it's always cheaper than I would ever expect. In the US, I get like a tiny bag of food and it's shockingly expensive. And I go here and I've got bags and bags and bags, and there's like produce sticking out of every corner and baguettes sticking out. And that was so inexpensive.
Yeah, we eat cheap. That's true. We eat pretty cheap in France and even cheaper in Spain, although it's catching up. It's catching up. Prices have been moving up, unfortunately, the last 2-3 years more than we'd like. But that's worldwide, I think. Huh?
Yeah. And the quality is just so different. It is such better. It's so much better. Our food system in the US has really had some challenges, I think, feeding that many people all the time. You go in the store and it's not all packaging, it's all unpackaged for the most part in some sections of the grocery store. There's lettuce in bags.
Well, you can find them.
Yeah, you can. But there's a lot of lettuce that's not in a bag.
Exactly. You will also find like 5 different kinds of lettuce that is not bagged and washed and all that you can do at home. It's best if you do that. Most people do that. All right, let's talk about traveling with your pooch.
So Junior is with me. He's with me whenever I come to France.
Has he done the trip several times?
He's done the trip several times, and it's always been a pretty good experience. He's small. He's like a tiny Yorkie, so he fits under the seat in front of me. The first time we brought him was kind of a nightmare process because when you have to do the US paperwork to get your dog in and out of the country, is horrible. I think I sent you the link for it. I think it's called Feathers and Fur Express is the name of the consultants that we use. I highly recommend paying them to do the paperwork.
That is excellent because people ask me this all the time and I never know who to recommend. So thank you. That's going to be very helpful.
They were incredible to the point that, so I was traveling on the day after Christmas with Junior, like the first time he came. And on Christmas Eve, they were managing a situation where, so it all has to go through the USDA, which is the people who like inspect our meat, but the paperwork all has to go through them. They sent me somebody in Florida's dog's paperwork because it all has to come to you in a FedEx package so that then you can go to the airport and do this. They stepped in and they knew before it was happening. And this other person in Florida was not somebody that this consulting firm had worked with. It was just some random person that they mixed up, but they were already on the problem and solving it and got me the paperwork at 10 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve.
Wow.
They did above and beyond. I mean, they were fantastic. But then once you get your dog into France, it's very easy. You just have to make an appointment with a vet, like a local vet, and get what they call an EU pet passport. And there's obviously a French name for it. It's literally a passport for your animal. Your dog has to be chipped or your cat has to be chipped in order for them to do the passport because they don't put the photo of the dog, they put the chip information on the passport.
True. There's no photo of the dog. That's true.
You have to then do your rabies vaccinations and things in France so that they can verify that you have the rabies vaccination current. We get one every 3 years and we always align it with to be here to get it renewed. And then with that, once you have that passport, you can go back and forth to the US and France. That's the only document you need. You don't need additional US paperwork. But in the US, you need this special USDA thing the first time. Because otherwise they won't let the dog leave the country if you don't have it.
Which is so weird. Like, why would they care?
It's a weird process.
Yeah.
And it's very poorly managed because if you didn't have a consultant, the poor people in Florida didn't. And they were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And actually, the people that we had hired to do it solved their problem for them too. They were so nice.
That's cool. So the first time is difficult, but after that, fairly straightforward.
Piece of cake, yeah.
And the dog's used to it.
Oh yeah, he does fine. It's a long flight. We have a direct flight to Nice from Atlanta, but it's like 8 hours. And so he has to wear a little diaper, which he doesn't love, but it saves everybody from a mess.
Yes. Well, let me tell you, I drive back and forth from France and Spain, and my dog doesn't love that either. Even though she has the whole back of the car and I have one of these solid things, she doesn't just get the back seat. She has the back seat plus something that extend where the people's feet would go. So she has a big area and she still hates it. When she can tell I'm getting the stuff ready to go, she's like moping and moping. I can see her rolling her eyes, but it's got to be done.
Well, Junior's been left with my mom or somebody, but as soon as he hears the zippers on the suitcase, he's like, okay, I'm going with you, right? Like, I'm coming. And I'm like, yes, you're coming.
So this is a lot more complicated with a bigger dog that has to be in the cargo of the plane. That I don't recommend you do unless, if you're moving permanently, that's different. But putting a dog in a cargo, my dog would have to go in the cargo. And I did that once with our standard poodle who was moving with us to France. And she was crazy for a few days afterwards.
Yeah.
Like she was not being herself, a normal, cheerful self. She was paranoid. Everything scared her.
Yeah. It's a very different experience when they're cargo.
Very good. Do not let a US vet write in your EU passport or it will be invalidated.
Oh, yes. I sent that to you. That is, I've gotten that advice many times. Because sometimes you have to show your rabies vaccination to your US vet to just be like, here's the vaccination that he had so that they can update their records. Do not let them write in it because as soon as they see any note from the US or any medicine from the US in it, it's no longer valid. And you got to do the whole thing again. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. All right. So we didn't get to your area very much, and we've been talking a long time, but the Valbonne area, the CoteDAzur, you love it, right?
I love it. It's incredible.
What are some things that you recommend most that people don't miss?
I really love Antibes. I think Antibes is just a wonderful little magical town. And the Picasso Museum there is really cool and interesting. There's a documentary that Richard Grant did for the BBC, which is all about sort of why the CoteDAzur became popular really in the winter with the British and Russian aristocracy. And then how all of those amazing palaces and hotels that they built got left in the summer basically vacant. And so that's where the Impressionist movement started. It was basically this artist community moving into these amazing digs when they were empty in the summer. And it really had been the summer vacation too. So just that whole history of the Impressionists and their lives down here. The Chagall Museum, the Matisse Museum in Nice are pretty spectacular. I also love a little town called Gourdon, which is up in the mountains. There's Pont du Loup and Gorge du Loup, just cute little towns that are on this beautiful river.
And Gourdon is part of that.
Yes. And I actually sent a link. So I made a little map of my favorite things. I actually shared it with a bunch of folks on the boot camp.
Oh, yes, you did.
These are all my favorite little spots.
So it'll be in your guest notes or in the show notes. But honestly, it's really good that you have this map that shows, wow, really nice.
Yeah.
Really nice.
And, I also I like Monaco. I know that a lot of people are sort of like, I don't really get Monaco. But I think a lot of people miss the old town in Monaco.
Yeah.
It's like a whole separate trip because it's completely on the other side of Monte Carlo. Couldn't be further from the casino. But just the gardens up there and the Oceanographic Museum,
Yeah.
which Jacques Cousteau himself consulted on. It's pretty spectacular. It's not a famous old cathedral, but there's the cathedral where Princess Grace is buried. And there's a lot of cool stuff to see in Old Monaco, which I think a lot of people miss
Uh-huh.
when they go and like stand in front of the casino, which is basically, that's like a mall, right? It's like taking a day trip to a mall, but
To
that
the
is not
changing of the
interesting.
guard. But if you're interested in old cars, there's a lot of reasons to go to Monaco. There's a lot. It's
Yeah.
mentioned the village of Mougins, which is
Lovely.
very nice. Yeah, a lot of it's just French people love that place.
Yeah. That's about 5 minutes from me, and it's just the cutest little village. It's not like a place where people live. Like in my village in Valbonne, people actually live here. But Mougins is one of those sort of, it's like St. Paul de Vence. So it's really just mostly shops and restaurants.
Yeah, restaurants. When I worked in Sophia Antipolis, that's where we went for restaurants in Mougins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they are very nice. There's lots of different ones, so you get a different choice all the time. Then you recommend some specific restaurants. So this is something I mentioned when I do trip itineraries with people. Île Sainte-Marguerite and Saint-Honorat. Those are little islands that you can get to from the boat in Cannes.
I highly recommend it. So the Laren Islands, or the Île de la, when you're in Cannes, you can see it off in the distance, these two islands. But to take a boat out there, and there's ferries that go, I think, every hour, or you can, for not crazy rate, rent a boat on like getyourguide.com or some, site where you can find things like that. And there's also a really cool underwater sculpture garden that this artist has created that basically made these face sculptures and then sank them in the bay between the two islands. And it's just so cool to see.
Can you snorkel to them? Okay.
Yeah, you snorkel. And they've got it roped off to boats so you don't get run over. And then Saint Honorat is, and there's two different islands. Saint Marguerite, I think, is a little more touristy and a little more like tourist shops and stuff. But Saint Honorat is still owned by the monastery that sits there, the monks and it's like a silent order of monks. It's just a very special kind of magical little island in the Mediterranean of monks and monasteries.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place. That's one where it's great to go for the day and just spend the whole day, because you can. So that's wonderful.
And Saint Marguerite is famous because it's where they apparently held the man with the iron mask. That was where that prison was. And you can go and see that.
Yeah.
Man with the iron mask.
Yeah. So for the end of the episode, I need to do a shout out to Shirley Franklin, because you shocked me when you said to me at the end of the boot camp that this boot camper who came, a friend of yours, is Shirley Franklin. And she was the mayor of Atlanta for 10 years?
Yeah. 2 terms. Yeah.
I could tell that she was very good at introducing herself and very social, very confident, very smart. But I had no inkling. I had no idea. She didn't tell me. You didn't tell me. And at the end of the boot camp, I'm like, we had the mayor of Atlanta with us? Oh, I was like awestruck,
She has this deep personal connection to Toulouse because her mentor, who was a guy named Maynard Jackson, who was the mayor of Atlanta in the 60s and 70s, who really started the Atlanta airport and made Atlanta what it is today. He also invented minority contracting compliance and how to make equitable investments using city dollars. He actually spent 3 years of his childhood in Toulouse because his mother was getting her doctorate in French. And at the time, for an African American, it was challenging to get a university enrollment for a PhD in French. And so she moved to Toulouse and got her PhD in French in Toulouse. So and Toulouse and Atlanta are sister cities.
Yes.
There's a long history of connection there. So, yeah.
So Shirley, if you listen to this and if you ever come back to Toulouse, which I'm sure you will, please let me know, because my brother and my sister-in-law actually work for the city of Toulouse. And I think I could get the mayor's ear.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, they would love that.
Yes.
They would love that. And in part of my new business, I'm making more of these connections between the American South and Southern Europe, because I think traditionally people have always thought that you had to be Paris or New York to do international business. Like you had to have a skyscraper, but now everything's digital. So we need to ask questions like, why is there not more business between Atlanta and Toulouse? We plan to make a lot of the sister city relationship there because I do see so many commonalities.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Brian. It's been wonderful having you on the bootcamp, talking to you today. You are a wonderful human being. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And to people who want to do this, go right ahead. Go right ahead. We'd love to have you.
Thank you for the boot camp. It was phenomenal experience. I love so much of it. And I have so many new friends from the boot camp. We actually had a friends of boot camp Zoom yesterday with just a couple of us who hung out together.
Excellent. I
Yeah.
love to hear that. All right, Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
In all of these endeavors, good luck to you.
Merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
The Join Us in France Travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2024 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.